Before answering the question in relation to FFD, I just want to reflect on this, the previous times in my life where I've been in this situation of deciding what's left to play for. And one particular incident I remember was when we were working on climate change in Greenpeace, and we were campaigning for more ambition. We were trying to push our governments, especially in Europe. And one day what happened was we got very confidential and very important information that the small island states, the most ambitious countries on climate change, had accepted a deal to get funding. It was an under-the-table deal to get funding, and then they would reduce their demands for ambitious reductions of emissions and system change, and having the system change would be replaced by this donation, primarily from the European Union. And this caused a crisis meeting in Greenpeace. Immediately, we had a big discussion. We had to stop our campaign. We couldn't be seen as the only ones calling for ambition because we had no government support. It was all gone. These were the most important governments. We immediately had a working group of civil society sitting and writing a very watered-down version of our position paper. It was very important that we get this done very quickly because now in this new reality, we still have to do it as good as we can. So we have to come out with a new position that reflects this new reality. We did also think that maybe someone should call some of the negotiators from the small island states, given that, of course, it was in all friendliness, but this information did come from the European Union, so maybe we should just check it. I've never, I think, never been so happy to be called an amateur, an imbecile, and an idiot. When I dialed up the small island states and asked about this new confidential information. Of course they hadn't changed position. They can't. They're disappearing in the ocean. That's their political reality. But I think it's very, very important when we get confidential, friendly advice from our governments that we question the source and that we don't just run off in another direction because we hear that maybe we will be left alone arguing for ambition. You know what? If we are, we should be proud. So I think it's very, very important because this is not the only time this is going to happen, and it's going to happen many times. And in addition to the confidential, friendly advice we'll get from some governments, there are also some civil society that just, we see ghosts. We're very afraid. We think, oh, maybe it could get even worse. And we lie awake at night and imagine the financing for development agreement from hell. And then we think, oh, okay, that's probably what's going to happen. And then we think maybe we could make it a little bit better. So we try and suggest minor improvements to this horrible agreement, which, if it gets agreed, it shouldn't have our fingerprints on it. So I think when we look at what's left to play for, let's look at what's needed, and let's stick to that. Let's not get sucked into some imaginary, paranoid political reality, because it's also going to be very strange to explain to our families why we're suddenly not trying to fight for change. We're trying to fight for a little bit of change in some realistic way. So what's left to play for? Very quickly? Everything. We haven't lost a single paragraph yet. So pull out the position paper, read it again, and get to work. But one thing about our position paper that I think is very important, because when I worked on climate change, we were working for changing the world as we know it. We were going to change transport and heating and energy. We were changing the whole world because that's what the climate problem is. It is a fundamental change. When I read our financing for development position paper, I don't see one single ask in there that any government should really have a fundamental problem with. We're not asking them for a fundamental change that's going to take many years. Just some examples on tax. We're asking them to set up an intergovernmental body. They're going to have some meetings and talk about this. We're not asking them to agree a legally binding agreement to ensure transparency and fair taxation and stop the race to the bottom. That's actually what we need. It's very, very obvious. But we asked for an intergovernmental body. We did that because it's an important first step. But it is a bit appalling that our governments look at us as if we said something outrageous. We chose a realistic first step position. I think no matter what we would have asked them, we would have been told that this is completely unrealistic, because apparently all change is unrealistic. On debt, we are asking for a multilateral legal framework, but they've already agreed to that. We're asking them to re-agree what they agreed already, and we're asking the European Union to go to some meetings that are already taking place. On private finance, we're asking for a review of what's going on. We're asking to make sure that private finance doesn't undermine sustainable development. We're asking for a review of whether it's harming human rights. We're not asking for a legally binding regime to make sure it doesn't, although that's, of course, what's needed. And actually, governments have proposed this in the past. On ODA, we're asking for timetables to fulfill the 45-year-old commitments, and we're asking them to untie aid. We're not asking for the new money that's very obviously needed now that they want to do the development that they promised. They want to stop biodiversity loss. They're going to apparently also use the ODA to finance some climate change, and they need to give it to the private sector. Obviously, there's a lot of new money needed, but actually we didn't do that calculation, probably because we would have gotten a very, very high number if we tried to calculate how much money is needed to do all that. So we made a realistic position paper. That also means that we don't have much space to negotiate, because if we lower our ambitions now, we will be campaigning for business as usual. And we shouldn't be doing that in these days. One other thing to be aware of is that there are some people that are much more ambitious than we are. We are, as the ambassador also mentioned, we are in a post-crisis reality. People on the streets have been through austerity, and now they hear that inequality is growing, and the rich are getting richer, and the multinationals are not paying tax, and people are still poor. And they don't believe that we've run out of money. So the public is much more radical than we are. And that's our task now, is to make sure that we go out and explain how our asks are a minimum first step to make sure that we get in the right direction. And if we explain ourselves, we will be understood. There's often this fear that if we're too ambitious, we're going to appear a little cuckoo when we sit in the meetings and talk about changing the whole world. But if we explain ourselves in the public, it will be pretty clear that it's our politicians that are cuckoo. And we need to connect this political will with the political accountability. So basically, when they don't want to, pardon me, when they refuse to establish a body to have some meetings to talk about tax because that would be too much to ask, we need to introduce them to the public reality, and we need to introduce the public to the fact that our politicians are somehow paralyzed and refusing to take even the basic action that we're asking them. So, last thing is that now is the time for media work. Now is the time to connect with the public. We've introduced our asks. We have a lot of paragraphs in the negotiating text. Now is the time to push. And that includes the European Union, where, of course, I spend most of my time. So a plea to us all is, don't be ashamed to ask for change in this world. Don't be ashamed to disagree with your government. Stick to the arguments. Remember the logic. There's very good arguments for why we ask for these things. And connect with the public. Because I promise you, if the politicians won't understand our asks, the public will. So thank you very much.